please welcome Managing Director of the Milken Institute, Mindy Silverstein.
Thank you. Throughout this conference, we've been focused on the themes of globalization and partnership. We have more participants from around the world than ever before, from Uruguay to the Philippines, Singapore to London, Japan to Rwanda. We know that, especially when your goal is impact on a global scale, partnerships make things happen. Partnerships between the public and private sector, between governments, between business leaders and investors on various continents. Our upcoming panel about Africa exemplifies this and the great partners that the Institute works with around the world to advance policy and economic solutions. Before we begin our panel, we're proud to support the official launch of the Africa Business Fellowship Program. This program will advance partnerships between Africa and the United States by placing future U.S. business leaders with leading African companies, giving them exposure to one of the fastest growing global markets, as you've heard over the last few days, and you'll hear again in a moment. This is a new kind of exchange, placing value on Africa's contribution to global business and the international enterprises and innovations that are emerging from the continent. I'm proud to introduce you to a close friend and partner, Strive Masiua, the founder and chairman of Econet Wireless, who has helped initiate this program along with other members of Africa's private sector. I'd also like to invite Bob Collymore, the CEO of Safaricom, and Jay Ireland, the CEO of GE Africa, who's also a member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, to join us for this special announcement.
Thank you, Mindy. As an African entrepreneur that has been doing business with the United States for over 20 years, I can share that last year was a truly exciting one for US-Africa business relations. The first ever US-Africa Leaders Summit was hosted in Washington, D.C. by President Obama. Over 50 heads of state were invited, but what made this unusual was that business was at the center of both US and African relations. Part of the summit involved the expansion of the US government's Young African Leaders Initiative, which brings young African leaders to the US for internships, exposing them to US institutions and businesses. Today, I'm pleased to announce the launch of a new reciprocal initiative, the Africa Business Fellowship, which we hope will accelerate efforts to forge a new relationship with the continent. This is an African-led private sector initiative in partnership with the Milken Institute, the African Leadership Network, an organization run by one of Africa's great young leaders, Fred Swanaka, who is here with us this evening, and the Management Leadership for Tomorrow, a US institution led by John Rice. As part of the program, each year we will select not less than 15 top American graduates and entrepreneurs and place them with successful African companies for up to 6 months. We want to give the next generation of US business leaders exposure to Africa's fast-changing landscape early on in their careers. We hope to seed a deeper understanding of and affinity for doing business in Africa. Some of Africa's most dynamic companies are involved in this effort, including Dangote Group, Danex Limited, Hollard of South Africa, Interswitch in Nigeria, Safaricom, whose CEO, Bobby Collymore, is with us here. And of course, it includes US companies with big operations in Africa, and you shall hear from my colleague Jay Ireland from GE. We're delighted to have them as partners. In addition, we've begun to receive very strong interest from US companies, some of them while we've been walking in these corridors talking about this program. My own personal hope for this program is that in 20 years, when we are gathered here at the Milken Global Conference, it will be filled with business leaders who are alumni of this initiative, together with their African counterparts who are alumni of the Yali initiative. and that we will hear some of that from them, that their investment decisions, which will then be rapidly increasing, will be because they knew Africa better in their early formative years. So we are only starting with 15 because we are hoping that some of you will join us to expand this program so that when the time comes, when we have moved on, it will be the alumni of this initiative who will be driving investment and market access and creating jobs for our respective countries. Thank you very much. Let me pass it on to my colleague, Jay Ireland.
Well, I know we do need to get to our panel, but very quickly, President Kagame, I don't know if you'd like to offer your mic, so if you have any words that you'd like to say, and then Jay will quickly go, and then we'll get to our panel going.
Thank you, Mandy. I can only commend Strive Masiwa and those who worked on this partnership between African young entrepreneurs and connect them with the rest of the world, but in particular United States. And the reverse order in which they have done it completes the circle, because we had many young people coming to the United States. Now we are having those in the United States coming to Africa. So this Africa Business Fellowship does not only add value to doing business in Africa by connecting businesses in Africa, but businesses in Africa to those in the United States. So I can only commend you and thank you for this great effort.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Fred, Strive, and John for the efforts that they've done. I feel like I was a pioneer 4 years ago. At that time, a 56-year-old guy came over to Africa, an American, to learn about it. So as a person that has a foot in both continents, also, as Mindy said, a member of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, I think it's a tremendous program that we're happy to support, and we're going to hopefully have all of you to support as well, because what we need is we need more people that understand what doing business in Africa is, and more importantly, what the opportunities are. And I think then we'll see a tremendous continuation of the growth that we will all see over the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Now, please join me in welcoming Bronwyn Nilsson, Group Executive Director, ABN Group, and Editor-in-Chief of CNBC Africa, who will be moderating our closing plenary for the day, Beyond the Headlines, Global Leaders Explore Africa's Future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mindy. And as Mindy has indicated, beyond the headlines, we are going to explore the future of Africa with global business leaders. Joining me to help me take this discussion further to my immediate right, we are joined by His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. To my immediate left, we are joined by Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and the founder and patron of the Africa Governance Initiative. To my far left, Scott Minard, who's Chairman of Investments and the Global Chief Investment Officer of Guggenheim Partners, and to my far right, Patrice Motsepe, who is a South African mining magnate, and he is the founder and chairman of African Rainbow Minerals. As I mention Africa, many of you probably immediately jump to the conclusion: Ebola, terror attacks in Nigeria, terror attacks in Nairobi by Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Nigerian missing schoolgirls. Perhaps you even have heard of xenophobia, which is currently taking its hold in South Africa. And then I also have to mention Oscar Pistorius and the murder trial that gripped many of you all over the world. Those are the headlines, but are they the reality? My mandate today with this esteemed panel is to, as we said, look beyond these headlines and look at Africa from an investment perspective, to delve into the opportunities and challenges. I want to set a little context around the continent, and for those of you who know Africa well, please indulge me because these stats may seem simplistic, but I think it's very important that you understand what we're dealing with when we talk about the African continent. From a size perspective, Africa is as big as China, India, the United States, and most of Europe altogether. The continent is made up of 54 countries, home to an aggregate 1.1 billion people. That population is expected to grow to 2.4 billion by 2050. Of that population of 1.1 billion, 200 million are between the age of 15 and 24, leaving Africa with the youngest population in the world. That youth dividend is expected to double by 2045, which then gives Africa the biggest workforce globally by 2045. The continent has an abundance of natural resources. It has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. South of the Sahara, commonly referred to as sub-Saharan Africa, which is 43 countries out of the 54, foreign direct investment has grown sixfold since 2000. Africa has grown at a rate of 5% and slightly more over the last decade, with many of the countries pushing 7 to 8% growth. And according to the latest IMF stats, of the top fastest growing economies globally, 7 of them will be from Africa over the next 5 years. So there's your context. We are missing another panelist today, and that is President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya. Unfortunately, at the last minute, he had to change his travel plans, but he has sent us a video message. And right now, let's hear from the President of Kenya.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see so many friends today, and let me acknowledge President Kagame, a worthy representative of our region, among a host of distinguished panelists. Why should Africa matter to investors? The question is pressing when we remember the background. Inaccurate perceptions of the continent linger. We must remind ourselves that Africa is a place of diverse countries and peoples. This conference presents a superb opportunity to replace the older, darker view with a much more accurate picture. Our continent now has the second best rate of return in the world. That said, US investment is lagging. In the last decade, foreign direct investment from the United States was less than half that from Western Europe and lower than Asia's. I know many of you present today want to change that picture. If you do, Kenya is the place to start. There is more to say, but my time is up. I remind you that we understand and respect the role of private enterprise. Thank you, and God bless you.
President Kagame, I need to pull you in here, but maybe you believe that Rwanda is the place to start, so.
Well, Rwanda is one of those places that are ripe for investment. I don't want to assume that it's the only place, but it is certainly the place among many others that deserve investments. And this is basically because of some of the things you've already stated. You gave statistics, you gave impressive numbers, whether it is in terms of middle class or numbers of employed or youth that can be employed and so on and so forth. And then the growth that has been realized over the years by countries. And one of those countries, for example, that has been registering between 7 and 8% growth every year for the last 12 years is Rwanda. So that in itself is a good story for attraction of investment. But I want to say that Africa should be, much as it was mentioned that it is divided, I mean, it has 54 countries. I want to see Africa more and more in a more integrated way, where we have regional economic groups and other integration structures which work better for economies. They provide more coherent and expanded markets which are beneficial and attractive to any investors. So that's why in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, and we've been working very closely with Kenya for very obvious reasons. So we work together. We identify where we can make joint investments or where we need to attract joint investments, say in infrastructure and other areas that need huge flows of capital and other areas. So really the real story is there, which you have said, and there are problems that need to be addressed. And I always think that we can attract investments as well as address those problems that remain to be addressed at the same time.
I want to explore that theme of regionalization a little later in the program, but right now I want to bring in Mr. Blair, who has made a very bold statement, and that is that Africa will be, for the first half of this century, what Asia has been for the second half of the last century. You have put the proviso, as long as African government leaders do institute the necessary reform. Do you believe we're on track to Africa is on track to take that position on the global stage?
Yes, I do, despite all the challenges. I think there's several things that I notice, and the best thing to do is to come and see, really. I think when you come and see, you have a completely different perspective. And my foundation, which puts teams of people to work alongside presidents and help them deliver reform programs, we're in 7, soon to be 10 different African countries. And when you go and see, you see the opportunities. There is a whole new generation of leaders in Africa today. President Kagame is one, President Kenyatta is another, who are focused on delivery, not really on ideology. They're focused on getting things done. If you're an investor and you go to Rwanda or Kenya today, you'll find an open door and you'll find a government that's on your side trying to help you. So these things, I think, are big and important changes. So there's a maturity of the politics. If you look at foreign direct investment now in Africa, it far outweighs aid, and has done for a few years now. And the truth is, across a whole range of things, because the middle class is also set to double in Africa in the next few years, you're going to have fantastic opportunities. So all the challenges are very clear, but this is one of these situations where the challenges are better known than the opportunities. And really the sensible thing is to invert that. And yes, there are big challenges, but there are fantastic opportunities. And even, Mr. Blair, the challenges represent opportunities in some scenarios. They can do, absolutely. But some of these countries, I mean, if you take Nigeria, it's just been through an election now and the transfer of power. The challenges there in Nigeria, again, are absolutely clear and obvious. But the growth is there. As the President just said, you're going to have possibilities in infrastructure, in tourism, in technology, all those things, along with obviously what Patrice and others know far more about on the mining sector and so on, financial service sector. There's going to be an extraordinary rate of development in Africa. And the sensible thing to do is to go and choose your country, because that's the other thing. It's people. When people say to me, what do you think about investing in Africa? I mean, it's a ridiculous situation. I mean, if you were to say, what do you think about investing in Europe? You'd say, well, do you mean Greece or do you mean Germany? You might have a difference. So there are, of course, differences between countries. But if you look carefully and you go, you'll find real opportunity. You mentioned Nigeria and the handover of power from one civilian government to another civilian government.
is the first time this has happened in Nigeria's history, and it is groundbreaking for the African continent. Scott, let's bring you in. Now, you are a new investor into the African story, and that investment was made last year. I'm presuming some of those conversations started right here at the Milken Institute Global Conference in April 2014, sir?
Right, actually the year before. We made our first investment in almost, it was about 18 months ago, at the end of 2013. You know, the thing that got my attention is the incredible growth in Africa, the opportunity which the Prime Minister, I think, correctly described, which is this is Asia. This is Asia in the early days. And you know, one of the most striking things about Africa, I remember going to China in 1988, and to put that in perspective, that was the year before Tiananmen Square. And I was back in China in 1991, and I was with a leader, and he asked me openly why the West didn't see the opportunity in China. And my response was to say, well, when the West sees events like Tiananmen Square, the West becomes confused. His response to me was to say, he says, did not many people die in your revolution? Because why should people expect in a revolution here that there won't be casualties? I think that in Africa, the situation is similar, which is as the continent evolves, we're going to have events and things which look peculiar to us as Westerners. But my naivete led me not to make the investments in China that I should have made in 1991. And I realized
and you're not going to make the same mistake again.
I will not make the same mistake again.
Patrice, a long-time investor, I think you started buying up your first assets in the mining environment in 1992, which is a long time. You've done very, very well. I introduced you as the South African mining magnate. I think your reputation precedes you, sir. Is the best still to come, Mr. Motsepe, for Africa?
You know, no continent has a right to success. 20 years ago, there was lots of optimism about the opportunities in Africa, and we were continuously reminded about the optimism that was expressed about Africa 10 years before that. But a lot of good work has been done over the last 20 years, and governments have taken the lead because, you know, Africa has to compete against continents and against countries whose economic environment, regulatory environment is extremely globally attractive. And we have to continue to succeed within Africa to give domestic investors, global investors, partly based on their experiences, allow them to build a track record that shows that the returns and doing business in Africa is as good and in many respects better than in other continents.
Patrice, you mentioned returns, and this brings me, President Kagame, to a question I asked you again at the Milken Institute Global Conference last year. Investors want to know that their money can be safely deployed, that they can make appropriate returns, good returns, great returns, where the rewards outweigh the risk. I asked you, Mr. President, whether money was safe in Africa a year ago. I'm going to ask the same question to you now. You said to me last year, categorically, it is safe. Do you still feel the same way, sir? And I'm going to put the caveat there that we have seen those terror attacks in Kenya, potentially with the ability to destabilize the East African region.
I still think the investors' money is very safe, and I'm sure that can be said better by those who have already made investments in Africa, because they are there. And we haven't seen many companies saying they have lost this or that because of what is going on, say, in East Africa, in one country or another. But this does not mean that we need to entertain or continue to have such terror activities that eventually, of course, would shut down businesses and bring a lot of losses to the investors. It doesn't mean that at all. But it's like I said, if you look at the whole continent, the 54 countries, I started with saying it's better to look at it in a form of integrated markets, which is already happening. But again, this does not remove responsibility from individual countries to be able to create stability within their own borders and create a sense of security for the investors who want to invest in those countries. But the investments would be more secure by these individual countries working together. They would work together and provide bigger markets, but they would also work together in dealing with some of these sources of insecurity that actually affect investors. And this is what we are seeing happen, for example, in the East African region. We have the East African community as a whole, and then we have been addressing issues of corridors which provide either specific aspects of logistics or infrastructure and so on and so forth. For example, the Northern Corridor, which connects Rwanda to Uganda and Kenya to the port of Mombasa. We've been looking at how this corridor can be developed so that everybody along the corridor is served well. And we have another central corridor from Rwanda through Tanzania to the port of Dar es Salaam. We are addressing that. And we are looking at the whole master plan to bring together the 5 countries of East Africa to see how we can work together. But we need to work together as well in addressing some of these sources of insecurity. And I think there are these problems. We have to address them urgently. But the opportunities are still begging, and we need to invest at the same time as we deal with these challenges.
Mr. Blair, let me put it to you this way. Have the security concerns in either West or East Africa affected your travel plans at any point recently?
Actually, they haven't, although I actually have teams of people who were working in the Ebola countries before the outbreak of Ebola, and much to my pride, actually, they insisted on staying there and working with the governments to try and help them through the crisis, and I visited them there, and I'll go back and visit them again soon. And no, the security concerns don't prevent me traveling and shouldn't actually prevent people traveling. Look, the challenges of Africa, particularly around extremism, I mean, Ebola is a very, that is these countries who have been affected, and I think in the next couple of months they will get the disease finally eradicated, and then it's going to be a job to help them back on their feet. The extremism is a challenge. It's a challenge right across that part of Africa. On the other hand, the fact is a country like Kenya has got enormous opportunities today. I mean, its economy is growing strongly. It'll carry on growing. And if you look at the different things that are happening today, you take the power sector. There's an immense amount of investment going into it. Infrastructure, there are projects in Africa that I know that have been talked about for years that are finally becoming reality. Right.
But you do need to get the security concerns under control.
Sure, you always do.
Do you believe that they are under control?
They're under control, but the fact is that those extremist groups that are trying to destabilize and cause by chaos actually deliberate damage to the country, I mean, they're very active and they need to be fought against and beaten. But if you take Africa as a whole, right, there is no doubt at all when you look at, as I say, the investment opportunities that we've just been discussing, they're there and they're available to people. And the actual pattern, one of the things I think is really important to Scott's point earlier is that when you take a step back and look at Africa over the last 10 years, you'd have to say there's been a remarkable transformation. And in all the countries I work in, I have noticed a difference. And one of the tragedies of the Ebola countries is that before the Ebola outbreak, these countries that were all post-conflict countries, by the way, all of them had severe conflicts. They were actually coming out Sierra Leone at a growth rate 10, 15%.
I want to leave the security issue, but I do often put that question to African government leaders, and they turn back and say to me, but there's terrorism all over the world.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. So, and that's why I think it's important that you take cognizance of it, but don't get it out of perspective.
Well, let's not dwell on it. Scott, talk to me about your first trip to Uganda and Rwanda. Mr. President, I personally have fallen in love with Rwanda, and we may have a similar feeling from Scott.
I do have to say that shortly before visiting Uganda, I had to have a security detail with me to go to Great Britain. Because there was chatter and rumors, and so the security detail issue, I think, is everywhere. But
don't worry, Mr.
We're going to look after you very well next time, Scott.
I'll give you a ring before I come.
Yeah, you do.
Next time we'll talk about the security issues in the
Yes,
United Kingdom.
Great Britain. But, look, Uganda, and this is really interesting, Uganda and Rwanda are very different countries. They sit next to each other, but they have different challenges and are at different stages of evolution. Rwanda, when I flew into Rwanda, and I'm not saying this just because the president is here, as we approached the airport, I looked down and I could have sworn that I was flying over Switzerland. It's an incredibly prosperous country, incredibly beautiful, very well organized.
You're sure you're not saying that just because we do have President Paul Kagame with us?
It definitely is.
Right.
You're right.
I mean, and a very handsome and dignified president.
Thank you.
Patrice, let's bring you in again from an African continent perspective. President Kagame mentioned regionalization, and for the many years that I've now been hosting debates with African business leaders and government leaders, regionalization really does seem to be gaining traction. We have now moved beyond the talk to forming communities that make it very attractive for people to invest beyond individual countries into regional blocks. How's that impacted your business on the continent?
Well, if you look at Brazil, 200 million people. You look at Indonesia, 200 million people. Mexico, 200 million people. I'm not even mentioning India and China. South Africa, 55 million people. You can't compete as a country against these vast markets. The future of every single one of those sub-Saharan economies, in fact, I would say the whole of the continent, is inextricably intertwined with the prosperity, the competitiveness of the neighboring countries. So I can't agree more with what President Kagame said, that we must continue. And the most important thing is we've got to accelerate. A lot of good work has been done, but the process of regionalization, the process of significant resources into infrastructure. Let me give you a quick example. Approximately $48 billion was spent last year on infrastructure in Africa, and this is regional infrastructure. Africa needs approximately $100 billion every year to make sure that the huge, exciting opportunities are really realized. So the most important thing that we're emphasizing in Africa is the pace of regionalization, the pace of providing resources for infrastructure, road, rail, the ports, telecommunications. We have to accelerate that pace.
We're trying to encourage US capital markets, vibrant US capital markets, to start investing in Africa. You are lagging, many of you in this room, both Europe and Asia. Now, as I've alluded to, the narrative for Africa began, certainly from my perspective, at the Milken Institute last year when I hosted the African Energy Landscape. I also, when doing research for this panel, went into the Pan-African Business Panel that was moderated by Jonathan Berman, who wrote Success in Africa. And there was a commonality among all the panelists in these discussions, and that was that doing business in Africa requires a local partner. Without exception, every single person on both those panels made that point. And I want to explore that a little bit further. Scott, specifically from your perspective, did it take the right partner for you to make your first investment into Africa?
Well, we'll find out if I picked the right partner. But I think that is an important thing. Africa is a distant place. It's not a lot like the United States, and I think having the right partner and people on the ground who understand how to do business and how the politics and regulation work. Here you are in sub-Saharan Africa, you're dealing with, I believe it's 46 different countries. Every country has its own regulation. We tend to throw things into buckets here. We're so far away. We think the emerging markets is one market. We think that sub-Saharan Africa is like one country.
You didn't hear the stats that I set out at the beginning of the discussion.
Well, it would be really interesting, I might ask, how many people here have ever been to Africa? Wow, this is pretty good.
We didn't need the stats at the beginning. I should have asked that up front.
Right. But a lot of Americans don't really have any perspective on Africa, and visiting South Africa, which is a very prosperous, well-developed country, versus visiting a place like Uganda are entirely two different experiences. And I think we get colored by the one piece of Africa that we think we understand.
President Kagame, can you give us any secrets to finding the right partners, specifically in Rwanda, as foreign investors?
Well, first of all, let me say finding local partners is very important, because a local partner and local knowledge inform the business and actually add to profitability and productivity of that business. There's no question about it. And in fact, in a sense, adds security to the business when you have local partners. But identifying a local partner is not very difficult, because we have different structures in the country. For example, we have Rwanda Development Board, which is really an interface between the private sector and the public sector. But we also have private sector federations that work together, that know their people. So if you come to Rwanda, it depends on what business you want to invest. Therefore, you will easily find information that will provide you the basics you need to identify a partner. So it's not going to be very difficult.
Mr. Blair, you've made the statement that African governments are looking for investment which moves beyond mere transactions. Mm-hmm. They're looking for deep, rich relationships from those investors that invest in their countries. Is that starting to happen? Are we seeing deep, rich relationships blooming?
Yes, we are. I mean, and not always, by the way, with partners. I mean, I think that you may choose to have a partner because it's a market you're very unfamiliar with. You may choose, sometimes in different parts of the world, you choose to have a partner because without a local partner, things can be difficult because of the regulatory framework. I mean, I know, for example, a major investment by an American company in power projects in Ethiopia, major agricultural projects in Sierra Leone that have been done by people without partners. I think, so it depends very much on the nature of the investment you're making. But yes, I think for African countries today, what they're looking for is a relationship with people who are going to come in, stay obviously for the long term, but also enrich their country by transferring intellectual capital as well. And one of the most important things, I mean, there's a debate that goes on the world over, which is somewhat around economic nationalism. You know, how much do we want to attract people from the outside, or aren't we better developing our own business type of thing? I actually find increasingly in Africa, in distinction from some parts of the world, this is not the case. They want good quality investment in, They recognize that if good quality investment comes in, it improves their own local management, it helps transfer skill, it helps build the economy for the future. And I think, therefore, you know, it really does depend on what you're doing, where you're going, but you've just got to look at the figures of the people that have come in and invested in the last few years, and many of those investments have a better rate of return than elsewhere, and the rate of default on investments is lower or the same.
I think Honorable Blair has added the important clarity to the answer to your question. Identifying a local partner is in as far as you're looking for a partner.
Right.
If you want to come in and invest your own money and work on your own, you are still free to do so. So that must be very clear.
Patrice, you made the comment earlier which referred to the $100 billion infrastructure funding deficit that Africa needs or has to fulfill on an annual basis for at least the next 10 years to build new infrastructure that is needed and to continue with maintenance of existing infrastructure. In that lies an opportunity. But I'm always looking for the easy wins, and I'm going to bring up something that I've brought up before at this forum and at the World Economic Forum, and that is that there is a project sitting in the DRC called Inga Dam. I'm sure many of you, as you've said, have traveled to Africa. You know then of the opportunity that Inga Dam could yield from a hydroelectric power perspective. It could electrify the whole of Africa. Why is that important? Because 7 out of 10 Africans do not have access to electricity. And we go back to whether your capital is safe. I see Paul Hinks sitting in the audience here, the CEO of Symbian Capital. So I'm going to quote you, because last year you told us that the DRC was a basket case and that nobody was prepared to put their money there because it takes significant capital investment to set up a hydroelectric power plant such as the one that is needed to generate this electricity. You did mention, except potentially the Chinese. I don't know whether that's going to hold you in good stead or not, but I am quoting you. So why can't we, with the power in this room, the power on this panel, get a project like Inga Dam sorted, which will power the entire African continent and potentially allow us to export electricity? Wouldn't that be a good starting point?
Yeah, but I actually think it's, look, Inga Dam, which I know quite a lot about, I mean, I think there may well be an attempt to put together the financing for it. Chinese are interested, actually people in America are interested in it. There's a whole series of connections down to South Africa and so on. The only thing I'd say is, and by the way, it may be a very good idea, but there's one thing I learned when I was in government, that governments are not always the best judges of what is a really good idea.
Yeah.
Well,
and so what I'm saying to you is that you know, whether it's Inga Dam, I mean, your general point is right. The only thing I say is, you know, you've always got to be careful of getting obsessed with one project. Now, I happen to have an interest in Inga Dam and think it's a fascinating project, but on the other hand, I know I'm not the best judge of whether it should happen or not.
Let me get Patrice from a business perspective to weigh.
I usually get huge comfort when your private banks, private investors are willing to commit their own resources. Because before they undertake any investment, it's usually preceded by extensive due diligence, feasibility studies. But without a doubt, of the $48 billion that is currently being spent in Africa on infrastructure, about 50% of that is from the private sector. 25% of that is from the African governments making some of their own resources available, because you do need, Inga can only survive within the context of a regional partnership. But you also have to be careful. The cost of electricity that you will derive from Inga, you have to compare it with the cost of electricity that you could obtain in Burundi, in Rwanda, in Kenya, and lots of other initiatives. So in conclusion, whenever private sector is prepared to invest in initiatives where there's partnerships between the private sector and government, they're more likely to be sustainable and long-term to be profitable.
Patrice, I'd like to make a comment. I think also there's a very interesting observation to be made of Africa. Africa does not carry the burden of the infrastructure we have. There are not wire lines everywhere for telephone. There are not huge grids all over the place that carry electricity. And that has given Africa a big advantage in that they're going to leapfrog us. Yeah. The use of cell phones and devices in Africa has reached a penetration of somewhere in the neighborhood of 90%. Banking is largely done by telephone. And now, you know, with the innovations that have happened in solar power, within the next year or two, the cost of solar will actually be competitive with what we pay to throw the light switch on in our homes. And so I think that the idea that markets be allowed to address this is actually going to work and accrue to the advantage of the African continent.
I agree.
We are running out of time, but there are a couple of things that I want to get through before we conclude, and I may just steal 5 minutes. Patrice, let's talk now about the hottest opportunities in Africa as you see them from an investment perspective. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and then we're going to move to concluding remarks. I'm going to throw something else at you. Yeah. The hottest opportunities.
Well, it's very simple. I mean, every investor, entrepreneur, businessman, in whichever industry they are involved in, I think go to Africa, look at opportunities, whether it's consumer-facing industries or whether it's communications, across the board. I mean, I'm always asked the same question, which industries or which sectors? And my answer is, go there, don't be discouraged, and if you see an opportunity in your industry, proceed.
President Kagame?
I think we are missing an opportunity now on countries. Intra-African trade and investment are very key, and they are not happening the way they should happen.
We're sitting at about 11.3% intra-Africa trade.
Still very low. And in fact, if we increase that, it has the capacity also of attracting more the kinds of foreign direct investments we want. But we are not getting things right. And it comes up to the other point which you just asked a while ago about INGA. INGA problem has become people looking for reasons not to do it rather than looking for reasons to do it.
Can we do it?
We can do it. It can be done. But
Mr. Blair, I'm not going to let it rest. President Kagame, you and me, so we are taking this on.
Yeah, we need to...
Each will contribute $5, you know?
Do I hear you coming in as well?
With only $5.
We'll chat later.
It takes political will, it takes really wanting to do it, and it can be done.
Mr. Blair, the biggest opportunities in Africa.
Yeah, here's my idea, that if you want investment advice, ask that guy at the end there and this guy here, and what myself and the President will concentrate on is trying to get government to create the right environment for business with predictable rules, with decent regulation, and making sure government's on the side of business and not against them. Now that's, I think, the right division of responsibility. So don't take your investment advice from me, take it from them.
Point taken, Mr. Blair. Scott.
Well, you know, I think since I'm the only American up here, and that's who we're trying to get to send money over, you know, there are a lot of opportunities in Africa that people don't pick up on. And the biggest opportunity that I have identified and am focused on is the emergence of the middle class in Africa. And there is a real lack of infrastructure, so to speak, around the middle class in Africa. And we've started with financial services first. And if you're looking for a partner in Africa, give Guggenheim a call.
Right, so I said we were building on the narrative from last year, and I mentioned the two panels, the African energy landscape, which I moderated, and then Pan-African business, which was moderated by Jonathan Berman, who I've already referred to as the author of Success in Africa. So what I thought we'd do, in conclusion, is that we would rewrite some headlines. Now, I don't think that the media is going to borrow these headlines because, as you well know, good news does not sell. But we're creating a set of new headlines. And I went through and I watched those panels as I made the point earlier. And I've extracted some comments from a number of people sitting in this room who were on those panels. Paul Hinks, I'm sorry to pick on you again, sir. This is a positive comment. So the CEO of Symbian Power operating in Africa, he is also the chairman of the Corporate Council on Africa. If you target the right projects in the right countries, you can make more money than anywhere else in the world at the moment. Raj Shah, who's a US aid administrator, the game is now. Have your project list, understand the risks that need to be managed, find the right local partner, and drive forward. Jay Island, who has just concluded the deal with Strive Masiyiwa, CEO and president of GE Africa. This is the land of opportunity now. You have to be in Africa to reap the rewards of the next decade of growth, but you do need the right partners on the ground. Kola Karim, from the CEO of Shoreline Energy International, operating in Nigeria, has an interesting one. I thought I'd share it with you. Africa is like a pair of dirty shoes. If you clean them, the beauty shows. Let's join hands and clean the shoes. Now I'm going to ask our panelists here to create a further 4 headlines so we can add to this list as we take the narrative further and hopefully the discussion on Africa into 2016, into 2017. Mr. Motsepe.
Well, it's very simple. Africa needs significant investments, significant facilitation of and encouragement of inter-African trade, and critically, we have to continue the path of creating a globally competitive environment for domestic and foreign investment.
President Kagame?
We need to, in Africa, continue creating a business-friendly environment and make it less costly in all ways so that people who want to make the investments don't have to worry about things they really shouldn't be worrying about. And also be able to forge the kinds of partnerships, strong partnerships that work in the favor of the investors, as well as places where investments are being made, so that it's a win-win situation.
Mr. Blair?
At the turn of the century, when I was Prime Minister, I called Africa a scar on the conscience of the world because of all its challenges. Today, I would say it is the most exciting continent on the planet because of its opportunities.
And Scott.
Well, we need a headline. So I would say, you know, the opportunity is now. Don't wait.
Don't wait. The opportunity is now. Don't wait. I think that's a perfect place to end this discussion beyond the headlines, discussing the future of Africa with the global leaders. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time.